Well, as someone said to me when I was in Australia in May, it's important that Australia doesn't let the UK's crisis go to waste. It's been an incredible fiscal tightening for UK councils in the last 7 years. Most councils have seen their real spending power reduced by about 25%. So it's a real tightening of the belt. And I think one of the really untold success stories is just how good local government has been at doing that whilst largely protecting frontline services that citizens rely on. How have they done that? They've done that through smarter commissioning. They've done that through switching to digital. They've done that through reducing headcount. They've done that through rationalising assets, selling off buildings, moving everything into one building. They've done it by shared services. So a whole set of kind of technical exercises to sort of reduce cost. But as one chief executive said to me, the first 25% is easy. It's the next bit that's really hard. And I think the question is whether we can continue down that track with more savings still to be delivered. And that's where you get into the sort of stuff I was talking about in the speech, where you need to start rethinking how you deliver public services. If you're really going to respond to some of these big long-term challenges, you can't do that just by being more efficient. You have to do it but by reconceptualising what the council is, how it delivers services, how communities are engaged with that, how you build in demand management and resilience and self-sufficiency into the system. So I think for me, the sort of the silver lining of what's been a very difficult time for local government in the UK is that it has made people come face to face with those questions, which actually we would have to address at some point further down the line. And what I would say to councils in Australia and in other places is look, you haven't had that same degree of fiscal tightening. I know you've had some, but you haven't had that same degree of fiscal tightening. But actually, demand is going to keep going up. You need to look at what people have done to cope with that and how they're starting to move forward into a different type of public service, and start learning from that now before you really have to. So I think the key thing is to talk to each other. The different councils in getting involved in these deals need to be making sure the communication between themselves is really rigorous, because actually whether government does this deliberately or not, what we found in the UK is that, particularly with the devolution deals, is that they were all done on a bilateral basis. They were all done in secret. There was no kind of shared information, and that makes it really hard for councils to see what other councils are doing, to get a kind of collaborative negotiating position across the sector. So I think the more you talk to each other, and there's a government, there's this kind of inherent tendency in national government to divide and rule. Don't let them do that. Keep talking to each other. Yeah, it was a great event. I really enjoyed it, and I just think it's always inspiring to go to different places in the world and hear about how people are responding to some of those common problems. And what really struck me, I think, was the willingness of elected members, of councillors, of mayors, to really kind of engage with their communities and to be constantly sort of playing back the voice of their constituents. And so I think it was that. It was there were lots of different people at that round table, but it was that elected voice of saying, this is how we're going to make sure that we put our residents' concerns at the heart of all this. And I think it almost doesn't matter. We get very hung up on the, what's the process for that? Is it, what sort of consultation is it? What sort of, it doesn't matter as long as it's happening. And so that's what I found really inspiring. And I think when you go around the world and look at how people are doing it, the common thread that successful best practice has is that it's listening to people and it's really engaging with the aspirations of that community. Well, I think just as I set out in the speech, for me that the key challenge that is pressing and urgent, a clear and present challenge, is this issue around trust. That we have a globally, it's not a UK issue, it's not an Australian issue, it's a global issue, that we have this collapse of trust in institutions. Local government is an institution, and it suffers from that collapse in trust, and it's fatal to all the other stuff we're trying to talk about, to public service reform, to engagement, to happy, thriving communities. Without trust in the bodies that represent people, none of that can happen. So for me, that is the single biggest danger that we face right now. Well, look, I'm not an expert in what's been going on with IHAPs, but it does seem to me, again, this is what central government does. There's an institutional logic. It tries to sort of draw power into itself. And I think we do have to resist that. And I think the way in which you do that, again, I mean, the risk of sort of repeating myself is by giving the community voice. So it's not about, and this is really important, it's not about local government taking power from central government, it's about local people getting that power. So I think we have this really zero-sum vision of power, right? Where we think if it's going to be passed from one person to another, then I have less of it, and that somehow it belongs to government to be kind of. It's why I hate the word devolution so much. If we're really good and behave well, they'll devolve some power to us. Well, no, power belongs locally. It belongs to the people in the community, and where necessary, we should evolve it up to local, state, and federal government. But so I do think it's important to resist that. But I think the way you do that is by bringing the community with you, and that it becomes a clear demand from the community, not from the council. Yes, is the short answer. I think it is. And I think one of the things that works better in Australia than in the UK is that you have a greater percentage of the council's income is generated locally through local taxation, and I think that does create, it's not the whole story, but I think it does create an essential basis for autonomy. Well, I mean, many of these problems are familiar in a UK context. You would say very similar things about London or Manchester or several other big cities. For me, when the question is posed in that sort of binary sense, it feels to me like a sign that it's gone wrong already. Actually, it shouldn't be about a yes/no decision, a community being against this or for this. It should be a much more nuanced dialogue happening from a much earlier stage. Of course, communities should have a say in all of these things. That doesn't necessarily mean that they get a veto on them, or that democracy isn't always about getting your way. It's about having your voice recognised. So, I think we need the community to have a say, but that's why we have a representative system. That's why we have strategic planning. These things have to be balanced out. I think actually, if you have the right sort of engagement from early enough, then you can start to do that. So you're explaining to people what you're attempting to do through those spatial strategies and why, what the downsides are, what the benefits are, what the trade-offs are. And I think actually when you bring people into that process early enough, then they surprise you with their willingness to engage and their ability to think flexibly about it. So for me, the question sort of, it's already gone wrong by the time you're phrasing the question that way. You need to start much earlier. Well, it's a great question, and strangely, I've actually sort of changed my view on this recently. When I came into the sector in the UK, people were obsessed with this question. There was talk about the central local concordat and the sort of constitutional status of local government. We don't, of course, have a written constitution, and people were sort of we talk about this all the time, and I always took the view that it was a bit of a distraction. And that actually local government's intellectual energy should be channeled into how to do things differently, not into a kind of slightly dry sort of legal constitutional argument. But I think I've slightly sort of changed my mind on that, because I think it starts with this. So in the UK context, I think, and we had a report out recently called Beyond Devolution that talked about this very, very specifically. Whether anyone intended to or not, the UK constitution has been thrown up in the air. A combination of Brexit and the devolution that we've had to our major cities mean that the constitution is all over the place. So it feels like a good time to be coming back to that argument and saying, actually, if we really want to tackle some of the really big challenges we have, we need a agreed constitutional position for local government that makes it clear what its powers are, what its competencies are, how it will be funded, and gives it security and an ability to sort of plan ahead on all of those things. But more than that, we think actually local government should be played into some of the bigger national questions. So we want to see local leaders having a formal role in deciding on the Brexit deal that we end up with, in determining the industrial strategy, in thinking about how local fiscal reform happens. So we're actually starting to push quite hard for an enhanced, more formalised constitutional settlement for local government, which is, as I say, sort of different from my starting position. How that plays out in the Australian context, I'm less sure about. I think you don't have that degree of constitutional churn that we have just put ourselves through in our wisdom. But I think it does. I think it is not always the most essential battle, but it is clearly where local government can have that certainty and that sort of solidity of constitutional position, and not be as you currently are in Australia, sort of at the whim of state government. I think yes, that is helpful.